In 1900, white-tailed deer were gone from half of America. 100 years later, there are 30 million of them. They're in the suburbs, in the parking lots, on the highways, and every year, they kill 200 Americans. The deer didn't invade. America built them the perfect world. This is the story of how that happened, and why nobody knows how to stop it. How you erase an animal. By the 1890s, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa had no white-tailed deer left. Not fewer, none. It hadn't taken long. After European settlement, market hunters worked the eastern forests with repeating rifles, selling venison by the cartload and hides by the bundle. No quotas, no seasons, no limits. At the same time, the wolves and mountain lions that had kept deer populations in check for thousands of years were being systematically killed off. Farmers paid bounties, states offered rewards, and the predators went first. The deer went next. Estimates put the total U.S. white-tailed deer population at roughly 300,000 by 1890, down from what may have been 30 million before European contact. That's a collapse of around 99% in the space of a few human generations. The number is a reconstruction, not a count. Wildlife monitoring didn't exist yet, but the direction isn't in doubt. State after state reported the same thing. The forests were empty. Nobody planned that outcome. The hunters weren't trying to destroy anything. They were doing what the market rewarded, the way people always do. The wolves and mountain lions weren't killed out of malice. They were killed because they ate livestock, and livestock was how families survived. Every individual decision made sense. The collective result was an animal vanishing from half a continent. By 1900, it was obvious something had to change. Conservation organizations began pushing for new laws. Market hunting was banned. Game wardens went out into the woods for the first time, and a number of state wildlife agencies began doing something that sounds strange in retrospect. They started catching deer in other states and trucking them in to repopulate the empty forests. It worked. Slowly, then faster. The forests had changed while the deer were gone. Abandoned farmland reverting to scrub, second-growth timber spreading across land that hadn't held a tree in a generation. Edge habitat, exactly what deer need. By the middle of the 20th century, deer populations were climbing in every eastern state. By the end of it, they'd passed anything on record. Nobody taught the deer to take advantage of this. Nobody planned the farmland abandonment, or the suburban sprawl that would come after, or the way a subdivision creates exactly the mix of cover and open grazing that deer have been optimizing for since the Pleistocene. The deer just found it. The animal that learned to live with us? Think about the last time you saw a deer. If you live in the eastern United States, it was probably not in a forest. It was probably at the edge of a road, in someone's garden, or crossing a parking lot at dusk. You might have thought, poor thing, displaced by development, looking for somewhere to go. That's not what's happening. White-tailed deer don't live at the edges of suburbs because they've been pushed out of somewhere better. They live there because suburbs, for a deer, are better. More food variety than a deep forest. Fewer predators than anywhere in their historic range. Limited hunting. Politically impossible in most residential areas. And the landscape itself, with its lawns and gardens and ornamental plantings, provides a year-round buffet that wild forests simply don't. Dave Reelman put it plainly. Populations of 150 to 300 deer per square mile, densities that biologists once considered biologically unsustainable, are now routine in some suburban neighborhoods. For comparison, healthy forest habitat typically supports somewhere between 15 and 30. The suburb isn't a refuge of last resort. It's the best address in town. Right now, if you live within 50 miles of the U.S. East Coast, there is almost certainly a white-tailed deer within a kilometer of where you're sitting. Probably more than one. They're not passing through, they live there. your neighborhood, your town, your backyard. It's their habitat now. They didn't move into yours. You built yours inside theirs, and then made it nicer. Estimates put the current U.S. white-tailed deer population somewhere around 30 million, roughly where it was before European contact, before the market hunters, before the mass die-off of the 1800s. That recovery took about 100 years. Every generation of conservationists involved in it was doing the right thing. None of them were wrong. And almost none of them were thinking about what 30 million deer inside a country full of highways and suburbs and farms would actually mean. The number nobody mentions on wildlife brochures. Every year in the United States, deer kill roughly 200 people, not by attacking them, by walking onto roads. Between 1.5 and 2.1 million deer vehicle collisions happen annually on American roads. The range comes from the fact that many accidents go unreported, or drivers don't file insurance claims. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety puts the confirmed death toll at around 200 per year from animal collisions, with deer involved in 77% of fatal cases. A 2008 report to Congress estimated the total economic cost, property damage, medical costs, emergency response, at over $8 billion a year, every year. That's not a crisis in the news. It's a background fact of American life, like potholes or afternoon traffic. Most people who live in deer country have either had a collision themselves or know someone who has. It's considered normal enough that insurance companies publish annual rankings of which states are most dangerous for deer strikes, and State Farm runs the numbers like weather forecasts. The death toll climbs during October, November, and December, rut season, when male deer range further and move more unpredictably. Dawn and dusk are the worst hours. Rural highways through the mid-Atlantic states are among the most dangerous stretches of road in the country for this specific reason. In Pennsylvania alone, there are an estimated 153,000 deer vehicle insurance claims filed every single year. This is where the story stops being comfortable. The deer aren't doing anything wrong. An animal following food, following mates, following the same routes its ancestors used, long before the road existed, isn't behaving badly. The drivers aren't doing anything wrong either. The infrastructure was built through habitat. The habitat filled back up with an animal that's very good at surviving. The two systems now overlap in ways that kill people at a steady, predictable rate, year after year. And nobody has figured out how to change that without changing something else that someone values. There's also the question of disease. White-tailed deer are the primary hosts for the adult black-legged tick, the one known colloquially as the deer tick. Lyme disease cases in the United States have tripled since 1990. The connection between deer density and Lyme risk exists, but the science here is messier than it looks from the outside. Some researchers argue that the real driver of Lyme spread isn't deer abundance, but the decline of red fox populations. Foxes predate the mice, and shrews that actually pass the Borrelia bacteria to ticks. Others point out that reducing deer populations to very low levels does seem to reduce tick density, but less drastic culls may not lower human infection rates at all. The debate continues in the literature. What's not debated? Lyme disease is spreading. Deer are part of the ecology of the tick that carries it, and both trends are moving in the same direction. The conversation every town eventually has. In Lake Makefield Township, Pennsylvania, the argument started around 2005 and didn't end for 8 years. The deer population had grown past what the township's parks and green spaces could support without damage. Deer were stripping ornamental plantings, colliding with cars on local roads, showing up in back gardens in numbers that residents found unsettling. The township board hired a consultant. The consultant recommended a managed cull, professional sharpshooters, controlled conditions, donation of venison to food banks. What followed was a case study in why deer management in residential America is, as one wildlife researcher bluntly called it, a wicked problem. Animal advocates organized against the cull. A local official received a death threat. The State Game Commission wouldn't authorize the sharpshooters until recreational bow hunters had been given a season first, a requirement that produced its own opposition, since many residents objected to people with bows in their parks. The bow season happened under protest. The sharpshooters eventually came, but political pressure had reduced the number of permitted shooting sites. They worked at night with silenced rifles and infrared scopes. The carcasses were removed before dawn. Nobody was supposed to see. The deer population came down. Within 2 seasons, it had recovered to near previous levels. This pattern, argument, partial intervention, recovery, argument again, plays out in hundreds of American towns every decade. The tools available are hunting, sterilization, relocation, and fencing. Hunting is the only one that demonstrably works at scale. Immunocontraception programs exist and have been tested. They require repeated treatment of individual animals, are expensive to maintain across a free-ranging population, and have not proven effective as a standalone strategy for large herds. Relocation moves the problem. Fencing protects specific areas, but doesn't reduce the population. Here's what makes this genuinely hard, not just politically awkward. The people who don't want deer culled in their neighborhood are not irrational. They live next to green space because they value wildlife. They chose a town with trees and parks and the occasional deer on the lawn, partly because of what that represents. Asking them to accept hunters or sharpshooters in those same spaces is asking them to accept a version of nature they didn't sign up for. The people who want population control aren't wrong either. Their cars get hit. Their gardens get stripped. Their kids are at higher tick exposure. They're watching an animal that's legally protected and culturally celebrated cause real, measurable, annual harm to their community. Both of these positions are internally consistent. Both people are right inside their own frame. There is no version of this where everyone goes home satisfied. The biologists know it, the town boards know it, and the wildlife managers who've been watching this play out for 30 years know it. Jim Sturba, a journalist who spent years documenting these conflicts across the eastern United States, wrote, "We now routinely encounter wild birds and animals that our parents and grandparents rarely saw. As their numbers have grown, wild creatures have spread far beyond their historic ranges into new habitats, including ours. Into ours." That's the part nobody put in the conservation plan. The one answer nobody wants. If wolves regulated deer for thousands of years, the obvious question is, why not bring them back? In 1995, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reintroduced 14 gray wolves into Yellowstone National Park. What happened next became one of the most documented wildlife stories in American history. The elk, Yellowstone's equivalent of the whitetail, changed their behavior almost immediately, moving away from riverbanks and valley floors where wolves could corner them. Vegetation recovered in those areas. Willows and aspens came back. Rivers stabilized. The wolves of Yellowstone are real. The changes were real. But Yellowstone is 9,000 square kilometers of protected wilderness surrounded by federal land. The deer in Cayuga Heights, in Lake Makefield Township, in the suburbs of Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, are not in Yellowstone. They're in places where a wolf cannot practically exist, not because wolves couldn't survive there, but because the political and social infrastructure for large predators in residential landscapes doesn't exist and isn't coming. The reintroduction in Yellowstone also triggered a decade of lawsuits from ranchers in Wyoming and Idaho, whose livestock were killed by wolves that crossed outside park boundaries. The conflict between predator recovery and agricultural livelihoods is real and ongoing. Solving the suburban deer problem by reintroducing wolves would trade one unresolved conflict for another, larger one. The story doesn't end there. It gets harder. The one tool that works, managed hunting, is the one that most of the people living closest to the problem don't want used. The tools that people find acceptable don't work. And the natural solution that worked for millennia requires conditions that no longer exist across most of the animal's range. The deer population estimates put the figure at somewhere around 30 million. It may be higher. The surveys are difficult. You can't count animals that don't want to be counted. And the number grows most years in most states. Nobody planned for this. Go back to that van in Cayuga Heights. Dave Reelman sits with his scope in the dark, watching deer move through a neighborhood where people are cooking dinner, putting children to bed, walking dogs on leashes. The deer don't run. They've learned that this place is safe, safer than anywhere they've lived in 200 years. They know the rhythm of the garbage trucks and the school buses. They know which gardens are worth revisiting. In some areas, researchers have found that older does pass knowledge of safe urban corridors to their fawns, the same way their ancestors passed knowledge of migration routes. Nobody taught them to do this. The white-tailed deer didn't recover because it was resilient. It recovered because humans decided it should, and then built a world that happened to suit it perfectly, and then filled that world with roads and houses and the kind of fragmented woodland edge that deer have been designed by evolution to exploit. The conservation movement stopped the killing, which was the right thing to do. The suburban expansion created the habitat, which wasn't about deer at all. The predator elimination happened a century earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with conservation. 3 separate decisions made by different people across more than 100 years, none of them wrong, none of them connected, producing an outcome nobody designed and nobody knows how to undo. The animal is protected by federal and state law. It kills 200 people a year and costs $8 billion in damages. The communities most affected are politically divided on every available solution. The science is clear on what works, and what works is what nobody wants. That's where the story actually is. Not in a forest somewhere, in the town you live in, or the one an hour's drive away, where right now a township board is sitting through its 3rd year of public meetings about a cull that probably won't happen, or will happen quietly, at night, with everyone looking the other way. The deer will still be there in the morning. They always are.